All right. I am back with Scott Ritter. After a year, Scott and I talked last year when the Russia-Ukraine war was starting, and we kind of took on this question of will Ukraine be another Afghanistan for Russia? That was our touch, that was our takeoff point. And we kind of concluded probably not, and for various we kind of broke the analogy between Ukraine and Afghanistan in various ways. But it's been a year, and I wanted to ask you back. So thanks for coming back, Scott. And there's a lot to talk about in terms of analyzing what happened in the past year. But the first thing that I wanted to ask you was basically one of the facts of this past year has been the incredible intensity of every fact is disputed. So it is almost impossible to tell who's even winning or losing. So if you talk to anybody who's listening to Canadian or US media daily, they actually believe that Ukraine is winning and that Russia is losing, Russia's on the verge of collapse, etc. And you have been saying, very confidently for the past year and even before, that Russia is winning and Russia is doing just fine. And they, I guess how somebody here is wrong. And, I trust your sincerity. So I have my suspicions that about which side is lying here. But like, if you don't know you and you don't know your work and you don't know who to trust, how would you go about trying to figure out who's actually winning and what is actually happening? How do we understand this question? How do we approach this question of what is actually happening with this war?
Well, there's two ways you can approach this. One is what I would call the layman way, the non-expert. And this requires you to dig into the motivations of each side, and then dig into the history of accuracy, not about casualties, but in general. Do they have a track record of being consistent with the truth? Do they have a track record of consistency of their argument, etc.? And so I don't, I'm not going to sit here and write a PhD thesis on breaking that down, but I'll just come up with some basic things. The thematic out of Ukraine and the United States and Europe is that this was an unprovoked war of aggression initiated by Russia. Missing in that entire argument is any discussion of Minsk in the history of negotiations there, any discussion of the Russian effort to come up with a treaty vehicle to avoid war, the two draft treaties they submitted on December 17th of 2021. And frankly speaking, any discussion of phase one of the Russian special military operation.
Can I just jump in, because I was listening to Chomsky and he said some really interesting stuff about this word unprovoked, because he said, you'll never see the word unprovoked about any other war, but if you search unprovoked war on Ukraine, you get like thousands of hits.
And which tells you something.
Yeah. And he also said, the other thing he said is, you can hate Russia as much as you want. You can argue about whether it was justified. You can argue whether it was legitimate, but you can't argue that it was unprovoked. He was like, it was provoked.
Well, I agree. I agree 100% with him on that. And I didn't even throw in NATO expansion and the history of warnings that came from the United States about the consequences of NATO expansion. I didn't throw in 2014, the coup, Victoria Nuland's role and what was the true objectives of that. I mean, there's just a whole bunch of stuff that is there that is no longer there when people say unprovoked war of aggression. It just comes down to basically they start, I think, on February 21st or around there when Vladimir Putin gave his initial speech, which people said that's historical revisionism. This is a madman. This is a guy who's trying to reinvent history. He's trying to commit genocide against the Ukrainians. And boom, on 24th of February, the troops go across the border. And there it is, an unprovoked war of aggression carried out by a madman who is guilty of historical revisionism. And that's the theme, and they've been consistent throughout. But as we gather data and we start to plug things in, we find out that, lo and behold, what people were calling historical revisionism on the part of Putin actually is a heck of a lot more factually based than the counter arguments being put out by others. Stepan Bandera was an evil man. Banderism is a ideology that is manifest today and a significant factor in the Ukrainian government. They have made him a national hero. They do have statues to him. They do sing songs in praise of him. They have transformed the entire youth movement of Ukraine to be in the image of Bandera and his hateful ideology. Yeah. Suddenly you're sitting there going, wow, Putin might have a point, but we're not allowed to say that because this was an unprovoked war of aggression. Right. But the thing that has escaped most analysts' point of view, because a lot of the Bandera stuff, I mean, I have very good friends who I plan on staying good friends with. But if we got down this path and we went down, we wouldn't be friends. Because when I hear them say, look, Bandera, the atrocities he committed were against the Soviets. He's a Ukrainian nationalist who was compelled to do bad things to defend Ukraine from the evils of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. Therefore, mass murder is okay. And I'm like, no, it's not okay. It wasn't good when Stalin did it, and it's not good when Hitler did it, and it's not good when Bandera does it. Mass murder is never a good thing. But even if you take that off the equation, we have to go to the intent of Russia. Yeah. If you're going to carry out an unprovoked act of aggression and you initiate your military operation in a manner which is designed to compel your opponent to get to the peace table as soon as possible and complete a peace agreement as soon as possible, you have to ask yourself, why? Why is that your motive? If this was an unprovoked war of aggression, why are you seeking to swamp the army, to capture the capital, to execute the leadership? Why are you preserving the leadership, preserving critical infrastructure, preserving everything that otherwise would be taken off the map? And you have to question now, what is the intent? And the intent of Russia appears to have been, we know it is now the case, to get the Ukrainians to the negotiating table to come to a rapid conclusion of this conflict, because that's consistent with Russia's history over an 8-year period for a peaceful resolution to this problem. So off the bat, go ahead.
This is good, because this is now getting into kind of what I wanted to do with you in this recording, which is go through kind of chronologically what happened this year. So in the background, we have that revolution in 2014, which was strongly supported by the US, in which they call themselves Ukrainian nationalists, Banderites. I think there's a case to call them Nazis. And they played a prominent role. And there's admissions, right, from people like one of these guys, Yevhen Karas, explained, we have fun killing, we have fun fighting, nationalists were the key factor in the 2014 Maidan revolution. And they said, he kind of dismissed the idea that they were numerically not important. He said, if there's, there was only 8, we were only 8%, but we were much more effective than the rest. If not for the nationalists, then the whole thing would have turned into a gay parade.
Well, he also is quite clear that it's not the total numbers, it's the percentage of your numbers that are willing to commit acts of violence in support of their cause. And when you have the right sector working for Svoboda, who gangs up, is empowered by the government to work with the Ministry of Interior to form street gangs whose job is to intimidate, beat up, and otherwise terrorize a population, it doesn't matter that when you go to the poll, only 8% of the population votes for you. When you turn your numbers into 100% of the intimidation, you are in control of Ukraine. And anybody who doesn't believe that the right sector is not in control of Ukraine. And I'm talking about every aspect of Ukraine. There's not a single Ukrainian out there who isn't intimidated by the right sector.
That's maybe arguably Zelensky himself.
He has been threatened with his life.
Yeah, there
if
are videos.
You sign Minsk, you will be hung by the neck until dead on the streets of Kiev.
Yeah.
Now, in the United States, if I threaten an American president like that, I get visited by the Secret Service.
You would never be seen again. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so then the war starts in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, where there's a huge number.
Well, the war
of
doesn't
Russian
start. Again, that's.
I mean, right shortly after 2014. This is.
But again, that implies what happened was the right sector began terrorizing the ethnic Russian people. That's not a war.
Yeah,
this is terrorism.
And a lot of
they rise up.
Yes,
to preserve their communities, preserve their lives, preserve their way of living. And then the Ukrainian government, which is not the Ukrainian government, is the right sector dominated coup government, calls all the Russians who are defending their lives, their livelihood, and their way of life terrorists, and they enact anti-terrorism legislation, which unleashes the Ukrainian army on the Russians.
Yeah.
Again, we're not talking war yet. We're talking about a government terrorizing a specific segment of the population.
And these are Ukrainians. We're calling them Russians, but they're Russian-speaking Ukrainians.
Russians, but they're Ukrainian citizens.
And they made I think you could argue it was after some time that they kind of went the separatist route. They originally, I think, wanted to stay. They viewed
themselves as the only legitimate patriots. See, they viewed themselves as Ukrainian citizens who supported the constitutionally elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych.
Yeah.
They were not in support of this illegal revolution, this illegal coup d'etat supported by outside powers and empowered by a minority banderist ideology.
Yeah.
So any concept that this was Russia coming in, generating trouble to try and get the ethnic Russians to separate is just absolute horse hockey.
Yeah, it doesn't fit. It doesn't seem to fit the chronology. Yeah. So then that's like what's going on locally in 2014. But then in the big picture, I think there's something else that happened that leads to what's happening today, which is, I think, and you tell me if you agree, but it seems to me that at some point in the past, 10 or 15 years, Russia's military industrial complex either caught up to or surpassed what the US could do. So there's a feeling that Russia doesn't have to just have these things imposed on it anymore by the US.
Right. Look, the Russia of the 1990s was a basket case.
Yeah.
The post-Soviet Russian space was, especially from the military standpoint, was just an absolute travesty from a Russian perspective.
Yeah, mortality goes way up beyond.
Your life expectancy of your average man drops significantly. Alcoholism is rampant. Family units are falling apart. The whole country is disintegrating. The economy is an absolute shambles, being exploited by Western capitalist interests who come in and use the oligarch class to extract wealth and then remove it from Russia, not reinvesting it into Russia. And it is just a downward trend. It's literally out of control, and the West is doing nothing to stop it. Throw that on top of that, you have conflicts such as the one that took place in Chechnya. You have other conflicts on the borders, the Georgian conflict in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. You have conflicts in Nagorno-Karabakh. So basically, you're looking at a landmass that is disintegrating politically and is dissolving economically. And you superimpose on that a military structure. And remember, it's not just the infantry, the army. We're talking about nuclear forces. We're talking about submarines with ballistic missiles. We're talking about road mobile missiles. We're talking missiles and silos. We're talking about nuclear weapons that go on bombers. The whole enterprise is there. And the Russians went into, how when a body gets shocked, how it automatically starts concentrating blood where it needs to be. you know, around the heart, around the brain, around the critical organs, and everything else just goes into shock. Well, that was what happened to Russia and the military. The military concentrated resources where it had to survive. But that wasn't in the rank and file military. And we saw this when in 1993, I believe, or 94, early 94, when the Russians went into Grozny. And the initial regiment that went in there was literally cut off and slaughtered by a couple hundred Chechen rebels. We're not talking about well organized. We're not talking about well trained. We're just saying that this group of Chechens destroyed a Russian regiment.
There's a military question in there actually, because I read somewhere that kind of lesson of, you know, making hay for the capital and kind of waving the flag and then getting surrounded and destroyed was something they have not repeated. And it's also maybe helps explain how slow their advance has been in Ukraine as well, where they're very sensitive to getting surrounded and destroyed or like overreaching their lines. I mean,
I think that the Russian army of today is casualty averse.
Yeah.
Now we say that, and we have to also recognize that this war, Russia has suffered, more dead in this conflict than they suffered in 10 years in Afghanistan. They're getting close to suffering the amount of dead that the United States suffered in 10 years in Vietnam. So I don't want to pretend that there's no Russians dying. They're dying in droves. This is a bloody war, the scope and scale of which nobody in the West can begin to comprehend. And that's not my words. That's the words of General Cavoli, the head of the U.S. Army in Europe and the Allied forces. He spoke in Sweden in January, and he basically said that. He said, what's going on there, we couldn't even imagine. We're not trained for it, equipped for it, ready to fight it. We're going to get there, he thinks. I don't think so. But he was just like, well, how do you even begin to comprehend a war where the minimum daily shells being fired by Russia is 20,000, and that's sort of the annual expectation of this. During the entire Desert Storm, the United States fired 60,000 rounds for the entire Desert Storm. The Russians sometimes fire 60 to 80,000 in one day.
And I gather if you're anywhere near one of these shells landing, it's like PTSD for life. Like it shakes your brain and your head. And
well, it ain't good. But we'll get into that because now we get into probability of kill and then probability of casualty, probability of effect, and how we calculate casualties. But you asked a question, a military question. Even though the Russians recognized they had a problem in Chechnya, they didn't have the resources to rapidly resolve it. And they fought a very bloody, ineffective war, the first Chechen war. Then they had a second Chechen war, and they got a little bit better, but still it was very difficult. From 1999 to 2005, it was very difficult for the Russians. They started to transition into what they call contract soldiers because they recognized that the conscripts just weren't up to the task. They weren't trained enough, and the whole way of 2-year conscripts is just self-defeating because the second-year conscript beats the hell out of the first-year conscript who learns that. So when they become second-year conscripts, they beat the hell, and it just happens. And it's just a bad way of doing business. So they transitioned to contract soldiers, more of a professional force. And the second Chechen war was won primarily because of contract soldiers. People
and presumably some kind of relationship with Kadyrov, and they managed to win over.
The political aspect, the hearts and minds. But Kadyrov didn't come over until he realized he wasn't going to win. Once it became clear that the Russian army was there, meant business, and you weren't going to prevail, suddenly you can have your bright light going off, going, oh, if I continue to do this, I'm going to die. And then you begin to second guess why you're doing it. You also have to get into who's helping you and why are they helping you? Why is the CIA working with you against Russia? Is the CIA doing it because they like you, or are they doing it because you're accomplishing something for them? And suddenly you realize you're on the wrong side, and you switch over, and suddenly the hearts and minds have been won, and the war's over. And that was a good thing. 2005 and 2008 though was to me the big wake up call.
Right.
What happened in 2008 is that Russia fought a very short war with Georgia, but the Georgian infantry, especially, had been trained by the United States Marines actually, and I mean, you can. It's not me saying this. I mean, I'm a Marine. I'm very proud of the combat capabilities of my brother and sister Marines, but it's the Russians themselves who said the small unit tactics used by the Georgians were outstanding. The way they fired, the way they maneuvered, the way they provided support, the way they communicated, it was echelons above what we could do. We won because we came in with mass. We won because we could just blow them off the face of the earth with artillery. They didn't have good fire support. They didn't know how to employ their armor. But at the small unit level, the Georgians outclassed the Russians night and day, and the Russians admit it. They were like, holy cow, if we had to go up against a NATO force where everybody's trained to that level on across the board, we would lose, and we would lose dramatically. And so that's the sort of the wake-up call for the Russians that went, we have to rethink this whole thing. And from 2008 until 2014, the Russians got into the business of, first of all, re-equipping soldiers. To be an effective soldier, you have to have uniforms that are up to the task. You have to have body armor. You have to have communications devices that enable you to communicate, weapons that are effective. And so if you take a look at the Russian soldiers fighting in 2008, and they're pretty much kitted out like your average Soviet soldier in Chechnya and Afghanistan earlier. And you look at the little green men that were running around Crimea in 2014, totally different, completely different people. The uniforms are different. The whole method of operating is different because they were learning. They were getting better. And but they weren't done there, because in 2014 and 2016, they said, we if we're going to be fighting NATO, we need to bring back these formations like the First Guards Tank Army and the 20th Combined Arms Army, and bring them back. And we have to start looking at tanks. We have to start looking at artillery, not to fight small wars but big wars. And they started reorganizing. And when you do that, your defense industry has to kick in. See, from 2008 to 2014, the defense industry was focused on what I would call the small stuff. But starting in 2016, it became the big stuff: tanks, artillery,
and probably thinking of Ukraine. I mean, ultimately, by then they would have known this was going to be the direction. I mean, Syria too. They have some.
No, Syria
small for them.
Syria was a sideshow. They did well, but Syria wasn't like Afghanistan to us. To us, Afghanistan, it elevated U.S. Central Command into the central decision-making body for all of the military. Everything from recruiting to equipping to training was all focused on low-intensity conflict. Syria doesn't drive the Russian military that way. It's a sideshow where units adapt to Syria, but Syria doesn't force the entire Soviet or Russian army to adapt to it.
Yeah. So it seems to me Russia is preparing a long time, thinking of Ukraine, thinking of NATO coming through Ukraine. I mean, basically,
yes. Starting in 2014, that became clear. The reason why they took Crimea was to keep it from falling in the hands of NATO, keep it out of Ukrainians.
And you've already mentioned the initial phase of the war. I think we can safely move into the February, the first couple months where, again, you were saying they're making these big moves, and it makes what makes the most sense is that Ukraine is going to probably have to surrender. And then something happened, and Ukraine just didn't give up. And the U.S. told them, we think probably the U.S. told them the Boris Johnson went. By the time Boris Johnson went, probably they had already decided they weren't going to negotiate. But like these big moves where they threatened Kiev and everything were probably trying to get Kiev to go back to the deal that they had, right? The Minsk agreements and
well, it would be beyond Minsk because Minsk was about keeping Donbass as part of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, when they decided they didn't want to play the game, and for Russia to go to war in Ukraine, and people need to respect this about Russia. you can say they're manipulating legal arguments, but the bottom line is they are assiduous about international law.
Yeah.
And they're assiduous about domestic law. The Russian president cannot order the Russian army into foreign territory without the permission of the Duma. And the Duma is constitutionally prohibited from ordering Russian troops to invade other countries without just cause. And the Donbass was Ukrainian. Now, an interesting thing, just an aside, a lot of people are talking about Wagner right now.
Yes.
Wagner, part of the private military contractor, Wagner this, Wagner that. Well,
they recruit prisoners, criminals.
Well, they recruit people who are going to accomplish the mission. And prisoners, when given a chance for redemption through fire, become very enthusiastic fighters, and they're cheap. So, but they don't do that anymore. They stopped doing that because I think there was a lot of controversy about that.
Yeah, they weren't.
Plus, they weren't. The problem with prisoners is that many of them there's a reason why they were prisoners.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily get redemption by fire that you're looking for. You learn how to fight. And you use those skills to exact revenge on other people and things. So I think they shut that thing down. But Wagner was created because the Russian military, as the separatists became separatists in 2014, 2015, they started to organize to take on the military, but they're still lacking certain skill sets. They're receiving equipment from the Russians, old T-64 tanks and things of that nature, but they have a limited amount of manpower that can operate this stuff. And so, but the Russian military is prohibited constitutionally from coming over and supporting them. So what would happen is they created the Russian, Prigozhin might take exception to this, but that's his business. My understanding is that the Russian general staff.
Are you suggesting that the Wagner Group is not a completely independent institution with no
the Wagner Group works for the Russian general staff and only for the Russian general staff. It doesn't work for anybody else but the Russian general staff. And the Russian general staff got Prigozhin to create an alternate funding mechanism outside of that which is mandated by the Duma for the Russian military, because again, they believe in the rule of law. You can't, and so they set up this mechanism, and Wagner was created. Wagner initially had a lot of what we call sheep dipping going on. So let's say you're the 8th Armored Brigade of the Russian Army, but then suddenly all your guys sign documents that get out of the Russian Army.
Right.
They sign documents that give them a short-term contract with Wagner, and then they hop into the same tanks and they go storming into Ukraine to fight the Ukrainian army.
Is this a little bit like Blackwater in Iraq?
No, Blackwater is Wagner is orders of echelons better than anything, better than Blackwater. Blackwater was okay, but Blackwater had very limited scope. Blackwater was never designed to be a armored brigade.
Right.
Blackwater was never designed to carry out shock assaults in an urban environment. Blackwater didn't have its own artillery. While they did have some helicopters, they never had their own air force. When was the last time you saw a Blackwater guy run around with an F-15?
It's always
Wagner
the same
has all
special
of
force.
this because that's what you need to fight a war. So Wagner is the Russian military, but it's a contract vehicle that constitutionally allows the military to operate on the soil of the Donbass, of Donetsk and Lugansk. And they're very effective, so effective that in 2014, they surrounded 10,000 Ukrainian troops in a village north of the city of Donetsk, and they were going to wipe them off the face of the earth. This is why we got the Minsk agreements. We got the Minsk agreements because the Ukrainian government, we're about to lose our army, they said. So how do we prevent this? And Germany and France went, we'll step in and we'll get a ceasefire. And they twisted Putin's arm, because Putin doesn't want a war. Anybody who says this is something Russia wanted doesn't understand Russia. The last thing Russia wanted was a conflict in Donbass. It was thrust upon them. Putin in 2005, again, people forget that, there's a CIA analyst out there who I like a lot. He's a good friend of mine, Ray McGovern. And Ray's an old Soviet analyst. I mean, old. He's so old that he predates the Soviet analyst division of the CIA. He was there before SOVA. But Ray he taught me something very important. He said, if you want to know what Soviets and Russians are thinking, listen to them.
Right.
Just listen to them.
Instead of listening to what the experts say.
Don't listen to interpretations. Don't listen to this. Listen to them, because they tend to say what they mean and mean what they say. And Putin in 2005 gave a speech to the Russian Federal Assembly, and it's been widely misquoted. It's the speech where he said one of the greatest tragedies of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's been turned into the greatest tragedy of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, full stop. And everybody says Putin is a madman. He wants to come back and return to the Soviet. If you think Vladimir Putin wants to return to the Soviet Union, you don't know anything about Vladimir Putin. Yeah. But the most important thing is what he said after that, because overnight, tens of millions of Russians became homeless.
Orphaned, yeah.
He is the Russian president, and he is responsible for the Russian nation. And the Russian nation is not defined by the borders of the Russian Federation. The Russian nation is defined by the Russian people, and the Russian people are defined by their ethnicity, their religion, their culture, and their language. And so when you have a large number of Russians, not Russian citizens, but Russians in Donbass being attacked by Ukrainian nationalists who view them as subhuman, who have a track record. Again, this escapes most people. A lot of people might be familiar with Volyn, the massacre in Volyn, 1943, 1944, where the Ukrainian nationalists under Stepan Bandera slaughtered 110,000 Poles, mainly women and children and old men. And they slaughtered them in the most horrible way possible. We don't need to get into it. Use your imagination. But what a lot of people don't focus on is the over 200,000 Russian citizens that were slaughtered by the Banderas from 1945 to 1953, when Ukraine was a wild west where these bands were running around. They'd surround villages, slaughter everybody. The Russians have documented. They have it all there, but people tend to forget about it. They don't want to hear about that. Well, the Russians haven't forgotten, and the Russians know that the Banderas view them as subhumans, as people not worthy of life, to be slaughtered. And so when the successors, the follow-on generations of Banderists start turning to ethnic Russians in the Donbass and call them orcs, call them Moskal, which is an insulting term for Muscovite for Russians. You have to take seriously the possibility of genocide, because what they're carrying out is cultural genocide off the start, where they delegitimize the language, the religion, the culture, the identity. And the next step to that is cancellation. And then if you're still there, they kill you. And this is what they do historically.
There was that speech by Poroshenko where he said, their kids will be hiding in cellars and our kids will be going to kindergarten.
And that's the mildest speech. There's other speeches about how they're going to go out there and, well, it's not just speeches. We saw what they did in Odessa, where they stuffed 150 people into the trade union building, set it on fire, and cheered as 48 of them died. So it's real.
Yeah, exactly. So they didn't surrender in March or April. But so that I think that was like an unfortunate surprise from the Russian perspective, which I think that was their goal.
So it was their goal. Their goal was not to invade and defeat. It was to invade and compel.
But then the fortunate surprise, I think, probably Russia was also surprised by this at least a little, was that all the sanctions didn't actually work, and that India, China, and lots of the global South just didn't go along with them. They refused to join. But this
was not some analysts like me, in December, I specifically wrote that sanctions would backfire and that it would collapse the European economy for this. But you know what? If you look at my resume, you're not going to see a PhD in economics. Right? I think I know a lot. I think I understand a lot. But the bottom line is, just because I'm certain of something doesn't mean it is, or others share my certainty. And what we know now about the inner circle around Vladimir Putin is they did not share my certainty, that they were very concerned about the economic consequences of sanctions. A lot of people say, why didn't the Russians mobilize? Why didn't they mobilize up front? Why didn't they declare war? Well, we know phase one was designed to be quick and use a peacetime complement to overwhelm and compel to surrender. But when that failed and they moved into phase two, basically from April until August, and it became this meat grinder operation where they concentrated their resources in the Donbass, but left wide open their flanks in Kharkov and Kherson. Why didn't the military say, hey, boss, we're undermanned on the flanks. This is a very risky thing. We don't have, our defense in depth where we have huge gaps in our line. We need to mobilize. We need to get more troops. But Putin is sitting there thinking the following. I mean, again, people disregard this. This is part of the ignorance of people who call Putin a dictator or an autocrat. Putin is a democratically elected president of a nation that has democracy. It might be imperfect in our eyes, but it's a Russian democracy. And he is accountable to the Russian people who can and will vote him out of office if he fails to respect their wishes. This was not a popular war. The decision to go into Ukraine was not a popular decision at all. It was a necessary decision from the leadership standpoint, but not a popular decision. So one way that you mitigate a massive rise in unpopularity is to keep it as a peacetime complement. I mean, the soldiers that are already in the military are the ones you're going to fight. You're not going to prevail on the citizens to cough up more men. And that's okay in phase one. But now you come to phase two, and the military is saying, we might need more resources. But phase two, Putin's still sitting there going, what about the economy? What about the economy? Because it wasn't certain what China was going to do. China has this Westphalian principle position about sovereignty. And China was like, we're not too happy about this invasion thing. We don't like that. India, the same way. We're not too pleased about this. There were no guarantees that China and India would open up their economies. That was still a negotiation in process.
Exactly.
There was no guarantee that Russia would be able to successfully entangle itself from Western, economic structures. And if they were unable to untangle, then sanctions really would have hurt, because now the Russian economy is tied to the Western economy. And so sanctioning it can cause the collapse that the West was looking for. So Putin's in the business of disentangling a significant percentage of the Russian economy, trying to transition the other economy there while he's fighting a war that's expensive. And he's going, holy cow, I can't. If I'm asking the Russian people to tighten their belts and face up to maybe 15, 20, 25% contraction in the economy, I can't turn around and mobilize. This would be suicide. It would do what the West wants and could lead to what the Ukrainian government wants and the Western government wants, which is a Moscow Maidan moment, where the Russian people rise up in the street and throw Putin out on his ear. So he has to tread very carefully, managing the economy, managing the conflict, and he can't do the things that we in the West say, well, that was logic. He should have mobilized them. No, he couldn't mobilize them.
Right. So what happens then is surprise, maybe to some extent, that China and India don't go along with the sanctions. And then a little bit maybe of surprise that that Germany is so willing to sacrifice its own economy for the sake of this war. That went a little bit beyond what I think anybody.
All of Europe, not just Germany, especially Germany, because of the absolute dependence on gas, but the whole lemming to a cliff mentality of Europe to say, we're going to sanction. The consequences be damned, if I could say that on your air. I apologize, kind of offended by that language, but no, that was very surprising as well. And
then we have Seymour Hersh's article, which is in June, in the middle of this process. The U.S. apparently sent deep sea divers to put bombs on the pipelines, which they then later blew up in
September. Yeah, well, we knew. I mean, it's not that this was a surprise when you have Joe Biden on February 7th in front of Olaf Scholz in the White House say, yeah, if Russian tanks move into Ukraine.
Smirked. I haven't seen him smirk like that since he was calling you Scotty Boy.
Yeah, Scotty Boy. But did you see Olaf Scholz's face?
Yeah.
He looked like a scared kid.
Yeah, and
I was just like,
yeah. And Hirsch's article says there's really not that many people that, I mean, Biden knew, but they didn't tell everybody that they were going to do it.
They just did it.
And
I think
I honestly, Scott, this is one of the things I still haven't wrapped my head around. I can't believe that they would do that to Germany. Like, it's Germany, you know, like it's their ally.
well, but the history of, I mean, yes, superficially, you're 100% correct.
Yeah.
Allies, NATO allies, longtime friends, American troops, the Brotherhood, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But if you go back to since the 60s, the United States and Germany have been clashing about Ostpolitik, about the German desire to have good relations with the East. We didn't want that. Germany wanted to open up its economy early on to allow Russian gas and Russian energy to come in. We didn't want that. Germany wanted a peace treaty. We didn't want that. So there has been conflict and tension and friction between the United States and Germany for decades. And the Nord Stream pipelines, Nord Stream 1, which I think came into being somewhere around 2012, and then Nord Stream 2 came in 2018, 2019.
Yeah.
But we were dead set against both of those. We did not want them. We viewed that as the Russians getting economic leverage over Europe. It was, sending us in the wrong. And Germany's looking at it saying, no, that's what makes us work. You see, we get this cheap Russian gas, and we can save, because you just said, 200 billion euros in subsidies to keep up. Well, imagine if that's what it costs now, the difference between market price, and it won't be that high because the market's gone crazy. Well, let's say it's 100 billion a year.
Yeah.
Over the course of 20 years, that's, again, I'm marine math. I might not be the greatest in the world, but that's like 2 trillion euros that could be invested in infrastructure, healthcare, education. There's a reason why Germany has such a high standard of living. It's because they can cough up 2 trillion extra euros for reinvestment into Germany that otherwise wouldn't exist if they had to pay market price. And the United States is looking at saying unfair economic advantage, unfair competition. Germany becomes the enemy. And that's why
Newland said, we're very gratified that it's a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. I can't, to say that, to just like spit in the face of.
Yeah, but the point is, we've all been lulled into a false sense of normalcy, thinking that the United States is the friend of Germany. Germany's been the strategic enemy of the United States for decades. Remember the animosity Donald Rumsfeld had in the lead up to old Europe, old Europe, new Europe, old Europe. That is reflective of, a ingrained sense of animosity between the United States and Germany that nobody's talking about. Mm-hmm. We have viewed Germany as a strategic competitor, and in some cases a strategic adversary for decades. So it should not be a surprise to anybody that we blew up their strategic energy infrastructure, because they are the enemy in this case, not just Russia, but Germany. And the Germans need to wake up. That's a domestic German problem.
It seems a very one-way
relationship. Well, now, take a look at the role Germany plays in facilitating the flow of information to support, et cetera. Ramstein Air Base, Rhein-Main Air Base, the Hamburg ports. All of this is essential for flowing materiel into Ukraine. So the Germans have to wake up to the fact that not only did we stab them in the back, but we're using them as a colonial.
And their foreign minister says we are at war with Russia.
With Russia, yeah. Well, Russia'd like to remind them, hey, go to the Bundestag, exit, turn right. There's a thing called the Tiergarten. Look at it. Yeah. You'll see there's a big memorial there. Flanking it are plinths with 2 T-34-85 tanks. That was the last time you went to war with us. Mm-hmm. We can upgrade those to T-90s anytime you want. That's what the Russians should say, but Lavrov's far too sophisticated diplomat.
So now that takes us to the September to now, I guess, phase.
Well, not really. No, there's another phase that's missing in all of this.
Okay.
Because the original question was casualties, and we're going to get to that in a second. Yeah. But there were significant casualties that took place in phase one. There's no doubt about that. The Russians took a big risk by pushing in so quickly without destroying things, because they were trying to hell, not overwhelmed. And some of their columns were cut off and slaughtered by the Ukrainians. So the Russians took heavy casualties, but they still managed to seize a lot of territory and kill a lot of Ukrainians.
I also get this sense of the, like, growing up and watching the way the Americans, fight. I get a different feeling, like when I've seen Russian commentary on when their columns are surrounded and destroyed, and they're sort of like, well, it's war, what do you expect? Whereas when it happens to US soldiers, they're like, no more Mr. Nice Guy about it, right? So
I mean,
there's
remember Nasiriyah? Yeah, Nasiriyah 2003, when saving Jessica, the blonde-haired, good-looking West Virginia girl that got taken prisoner.
I must have missed this.
Her seventh motor transport company or whatever got lost, took a wrong turn, and they ended up going through Nasiriyah, getting ambushed by the Iraqis. Most of them were killed, some of them retreated, some were captured, and it became a big deal that we lost troops and all that stuff. And the Russians, the Russian attitude would be, shouldn't have made that right-hand turn.
It's a little different. It does seem a little culturally different.
But the Russians took casualties, but not a lot. Yeah. But now they move into the next phase, which is this meat grinder phase. We talk about the Battle of Bakhmut taking place today. That battle began in May, in earnest. In May of it wasn't in Bakhmut; it was further to the west or east.
To the east.
Yeah, to the east. But that meat grinder, where the Russians said, "Okay, no more thrusts. We're going to sit here. We're going to grind them down with artillery, massive artillery, and then we're going to move in, clear the trench, grind them down again, move in, clear the trench."
And this is happening because this is like a very fortified
area. For 8 years, the Ukrainians have turned this into an anthill, concrete bunkers. And if you take a trench, be careful, because there's a bunker there that's going to shoot down the trench line to kill you that you didn't see. And if you get traditional trench clearing operations, you would suffer horrendous casualties.
Yeah.
So, and you can't just, overwhelm that one trench line, because you get bogged down in the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth trench line down there. It's just impossible. But so the Russians slowed it down and then just started hitting them with artillery, and they were grinding them away, and they were destroying the Ukrainian army. And frankly speaking, the Ukrainians lost this war sometime in June or July of last summer.
And they lost via basically artillery destruction.
Artillery grinding them down. But then comes the game changer, which is not game winner, game changer. Because the game right now is Russia grinding you down to nothing. Yeah. The game changer is NATO providing billions of dollars of fresh equipment that were then used to train new units using Western tactics with Western intelligence, Western communications, Western weapons. And they came in, and remember when I talked about the overextended flanks? When you've got 1,500 kilometers of frontage, and you've put most of your troops in the central area, what's left to cover this might be 50 guys per kilometer. I don't know when the last time you went for a hike and marched south the clock, but
can't see that guy.
Imagine defending an area of 50 guys. In some cases, 50 guys for 5 kilometers.
Right.
And there was no artillery, because all the artillery was focused on the central battlefield. So all the artillery is supposed to cover that gap. So if the enemy comes in and shoots the gap between two widely dispersed defensive points, normally the artillery will hit it. Plus, doctrinally, there should be a second defense line and a third defense line to slow them down, so artillery can then again hit it. There's no artillery, there's no second defense line, there's no third defense line. And these Ukrainian units that were trained to exploit the intelligence that the United States was collecting, where the gap is, they just went through that gap and they kept going. And they'd go 20, 30 kilometers into the rear and start raising havoc in the Russian rear. So the Russians made the decision, because they had some, and the other thing is, the units that were manning the front lines were, in many cases, police SWAT teams.
Yeah, so there is this kind of economy of force that Russia had been applying up until they mobilized.
They did it there because they couldn't mobilize, because they didn't mobilize. So they had insufficient resources to the task. All the combat effective units were gathered in the central area, and the other ones weren't. And so the Ukrainians exploited it.
And
And
so,
what is
yeah,
the
I mean,
Russian?
that's very interesting because the Ukrainians they have a real time complete picture of where the Russians are because the
Everything.
Americans are
Yep.
giving that to them all the time.
And
Yeah.
they exploited it very well. I mean,
Mhm.
hats off to the Ukrainians. As a military person, I'm sitting there going,
Yeah.
wow, impressive. But what the Russians did is they said, we're not going to sacrifice the lives,
Yeah.
the Hitler hedgehog. Remember in the,
Yep.
well, say remember, if you've read the history of the Battle of Moscow, when
Yep.
the Russians launched their winter offensive to push the Russians back or the Germans back, Hitler ordered the troops not to retreat 1 inch, to hedgehog in, hold up. And they break the back of the Russian attack, absorb. Some of the hedgehogs were overwhelmed, other ones held, and eventually the Soviets lost their offensive surge, and the Germans were able to consolidate the line, but at great cost, horrific cost. Well, the Russians didn't hedgehog. They went, we're not
Mhm.
playing that game. Everybody up to the rear. Hey, boss, we got 12 tanks that aren't fueled. Leave them. Boss, we got equipment that's not ready. Leave it. I want the
Yep.
manpower out of here.
Yep.
Abandon the equipment. We can get new equipment. We can't get new manpower. They pulled them back and they consolidated the defensive line and started to defend doctrinally with proper unit concentration, artillery, defense in depth. And the Ukrainians ended up breaking their neck against this. And all those troops that they built up, they lost. Ask yourself why today the Ukrainians are begging for weaponry, because everything we gave them is gone. Ask them why they're why they're kidnapping men off the street, because we've killed all the reserves that they built up. Meanwhile, for the first time, Putin is calling his people in, and they said, hey, this is a new kind of war. This is no longer Russia versus Ukraine. This is Russia versus the collective West, Russia versus NATO.
And that happened incrementally because it's like there's
Correct.
HIMARS, then there's tanks, now
Tanks and
there's
all.
F-16s.
Right. It didn't happen all at once.
But it's sort of, and this is what makes it kind of scary, right? Because it's like there's this, they're sending this, and then the Russians have to match, and then NATO sends more, and so
Russia's never had to match; they had to adapt.
they had to
I mean, I'll
adapt.
tell
Yeah.
you, there's 3 weapon systems that have proven to be very problematic for the Russians. One is the M777 American howitzer. The other one is the French Caesar mobile artillery piece.
These are all artillery. This is just,
all artillery. And then the last one is HIMARS.
Yeah.
All 3 of these, you see the Russians, just like everybody, you fall into a pattern of behavior. So you take what the enemy is going to give you. So if the enemy is using ineffective D-30, D-20, 2S1, 2S3 Soviet era howitzers, you adapt to that, to the range and the accuracy. And so you get lazy. So for instance, you might take your command post, and instead of doing an Alpha Bravo command post, jumping it, so if you lose one, you still have command, you'll put everybody into one because it's more convenient, less gas, easier, and you'll move it up to the front, and you'll do that logistically instead of spreading your ammo dumps out, again, which requires a lot of vehicles and a lot of coordination. You just say, bring them all together and cluster them here, and we have a central ammunition supply. And they were doing that as part of this meat grinder war. And suddenly, these new artillery pieces come in with high precision rounds, longer range, and perfect intelligence. And so the U.S. is sitting there going, command post of the X battalion of the X brigade is right here, right now. The general's there. And the Ukrainians went, thank you very much. Boom, 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 bam. You suddenly have a dead general, a dead staff. There are
some of those stories.
Their ammunition's all here. Boom, boom, boom. Bam, you just took out 4 days supply of ammunition for the frontline units. And the Russians went, holy cow. So now they had to go back and adapt. First, they had to adapt to the M777. They had to adapt to the Caesar. They had to adapt to the HIMARS. But they have done so. Now they have operational methodologies in place that minimize. Plus, they've carried out very effective counter battery operations. The M777 is almost an extinct species right now on the battlefield. The Caesar can't mass fires. It's moving in, firing, and leaving, because if it stays there, drones connect it, and the Russians are hitting it. And HIMARS, the Russians are shooting down 90% of the missiles launched.
What do you make of the Iranian drone story? Is this real?
Well, when it first came out, I discounted it.
Yeah.
I mean, I believe the intelligence because they showed the photographs of the Russian specialists there, and I said, okay, but it's becoming a drone war. Early on it was like advantage Ukraine with the Turkish drones.
Yeah.
And you saw the videotapes of the drones firing things and killing Chechens and killing people. But then the Russians adapted and they started shooting down the Turkish drones, bringing electronic warfare. So, I mean, some innovative stuff's come in here. A drone gun. Have you seen it?
Yeah.
It's this big, giant electronic thing, and you aim it at the drone and you jam the signal to the satellite, and the drone goes stupid.
Yeah.
And now they have other systems in place that do the same thing. So they nullified the Turkish drones. But now you got these little commercial drones coming in, dropping grenades and all this kind of stuff. But the drone war is actually far more sophisticated than that. It's not just loitering munitions like the Russians call it the Lancet, and I forget what we call our loitering drone, which is not very good, by the way. But they still need the Russians. I think I spoke to a Russian officer, and he said, "Yeah, we had a drone doctrine that was geared towards sort of a large-scale maneuver conflict with NATO. What it wasn't geared for is this positional warfare war of attrition. And so we don't have the tools for this job." So they went to the Iranians and said, "What do you got?" The Iranians went, "We got this, we got that." And the Russians went, "We like this." And apparently they procured some intact sets, although nobody's admitted that yet. But I think some of the debris that's been found indicates that they were intact. But they in kits, and then the Iranians came and worked with the Soviet defense industry or Russian defense industry, so the Russians could produce it from scratch. And so what we're seeing right now and then the other thing the Russians do, because they're very good, they employ it and they learn things about it. They learn how the Ukrainians are, so then they adapt it. So we're on something like the 10th generation of the Shahed 136 Geranium-2 drone that now has different materials, different capabilities, different variants. They have dummies that go in to get the radar up, and they have other variants that come in right after that to hit the radars. And it's been a game changer.
So the U.S. is going to be upset because presumably maybe the Russians will share some of this insight back to the Iranians. And this is one of the problems that the
Not
U.S.
just the Iranians,
has
the Chinese.
Yeah, this is one of the problems that the U.S. has now, which is, announcing like, we want regime change in Iran, we want regime change in China, we want regime change in Russia, and also we expect China to help us against Russia. We expect Iran to stay out of it, but there's no incentive to anybody to do that.
None whatsoever. And if you're going to target a nation, then they're going to help another targeted nation, and they're going to feed. Look, the Iranians are getting some very useful insight into how the West fights, technologies that are involved, and also about drone warfare. I mean, the Iranians are pretty good at it. Just ask the Saudis about the Houthis who fire them. But they're getting better now. And this is a part of the war that I don't think people are. We talk about an artillery war, but it's a lot of the artillery is supported by drones who collect the targeted intelligence, feed it back, and then also these loitering munitions, which are sort of an extension of artillery. It's still fire support going in and taking out artillery pieces and everything. And the Russians are very, very good at this. But now this is the NATO attack, that phase. But now Putin becomes liberated because he's starting to get, first of all, he's able to articulate to the Russian population that this is no longer a Russian-Ukrainian conflict. This is a Russian conflict against the collective West.
And there's so many admissions. There's just so many admissions from NATO officials.
You don't even have to make it up. You there it is. And the important thing is that the Russian people, by and large, bought into it. Meaning, and it wasn't a hard sell. They went, we agree with you, boss. This has changed. It's not us versus Ukraine. This is the West trying to destroy us with a strategic objective of the strategic defeat of Russia, and we can't allow that to happen. The other news.
Can we just maybe 2 minutes on the biolab thing? Because the biolab just was so bizarre, right? Russia captures some things and they say, listen, we think we have documents proving that the US was working on biological weapons targeting Slavs, experimenting on Ukraine, like some just bizarre stuff, hard to believe.
No, I believe every single word of it.
And then they ask Nuland, and Nuland says something like, no, we don't have though. Ukraine doesn't have that, but God forbid if it falls into the Russian hands. So it's like, wait, but what are you afraid of? If
but it's not even Nuland. Before the war started, the American who was First of all, it's not a question. We had biolabs in Ukraine. It's unclassified. We have documents. We brag about it. It's part of the Cooperative Threat Reduction Agency, program to go in there and provide an employment mechanism for Ukrainian biologists so they don't take their weapons of mass destruction skills elsewhere. And then it became a vehicle of doing advanced experimentation, maybe in a atmosphere that was less restrictive than what you would get in the United States. And I will say this, every document the Russian have that I've looked at is 100% accurate. Their interpretation of those documents might not be that, but a
little pessimistic, or
they might be reading more into something than actually was. But the bottom line is we were doing some things that were unsavory, unethical, and frankly speaking, illegal from a weapons of mass destruction management standpoint. We are signatories to the Biological Toxin and Weapons Convention, and we are in violation of that straight up by our own admission. That's what shocked me when the director of this program was saying, well, the thing that worries me the most is that the Russians might bomb one of these facilities and take out the power to the refrigeration and then crack the containment. And so as these things thaw, they could be released, and we might have some of the old Soviet pathogens be released. I'm like, wait a minute. There are not supposed to be any Soviet pathogens. They were all supposed to be destroyed. You took control of this facility. The treaty obligates you not to receive or retain these kind of things. They should have been destroyed. We're coming on 17 years into this program, and you're telling me it's still there.
Oh,
why?
That reminds me. I also don't want to neglect the fact that there was the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, which was
being shelled on a daily basis by the Ukrainians. Deliberately so. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Ukrainians, they don't get a pass, and neither do the United States. And this all factors in. Remember at the beginning I was talking about there's two ways to calculate casualties. One is to evaluate the consistency of the argument. Yeah. The Russians have been consistent from day one. They don't. Russians are not very good at information warfare, meaning they're not good propagandists who sell what they're doing. They just do it. Whereas we're spinning all the time. We're like hamsters in a wheel, just spinning, trying to explain away stuff, deny, admit, deny, admit. And it colors your impression. But so Putin now is able to mobilize 300,000 reservists. Now, what was interesting about that is, depending on whose figures you use, maybe upwards of 200,000 Russians fled. Russian men fled. But notice that the Russians didn't close their borders.
Yeah.
The Russians didn't try to stop them. The Russians went, "Do svidaniya," leave. Because the people who fled were basically the constituency of Russian oppositionists like Navalny. In fact, many of them who fled as part of a Navalny-driven propaganda campaign where they fled and then they would start speaking to the media, telling the same story, trying to spin things to influence what's going on back in Russia. But back in Russia, you have the rest of the population very stoically saying, yeah, we got to do this. Oh, you're calling me up? I don't want to do it, but I'm going to do it. I show up, going to get trained. And I liken what has happened to Russia to something that I read about in Rick Atkinson's wonderful trilogy about the U.S. Army in World War II. It starts off with the North Africa campaign. Second volume is about Sicily and Italy. Third volume is about Europe. But by the time you get to the end of the second volume, you see this conscript military, these draftees in the United States who didn't want to be there. I mean, everybody's talking about Pearl Harbor effect sign. These guys didn't want to be there. They wanted to be home. They were drafted. But there's this growing recognition that war is a nasty business, and the only way you're going to get home is by killing the enemy and ending the war. And so these draftees became hardened killers and who were committed to the awful task of war. And I look at these 300,000 and I look at them coming in and I'm like, they don't get to go home until the war is over. Mm-hmm. And they want to be home. And they also believe in the mission. They understand this is an existential conflict where the NATO is trying to kill them. And these guys are going to do the job. Mm-hmm. They're going to do the hard job. They're going to die. They're going to be wounded. but they're going to kill the Ukrainians, and they're not going to stop killing them until this job is done. And that's where we are today.
And unfortunately, the Ukrainians have the same mentality, right? I mean,
well, they do, but they're running out of guys with that mentality.
Well, this is the Moon of, I believe Moon of Alabama said something like Russia has already destroyed the Ukrainian army twice and is in the process of destroying the third version.
Time. Yeah, I agree. Look, so. now we come to the question of how do we count casualties? And the one way again is the consistency of argument. And I think I've made the case that I feel that the Russians are far more consistent in their entire approach to talking about this war. They've been honest. There's consistency in the argument, et cetera. And we can see distinctive phases. Whereas the Ukrainians from day one have been just trying to sell us the Brooklyn Bridge. They're like a used car salesman trying to impress me with shiny chrome and all that, but the engine don't work. But that's okay. Now I pull into the professional side. You see, again, I'm not bragging, but I had some pretty relevant experiences in my life. And one of the most relevant took place between October and December of 1990, when I was assigned to the warfighting center at Quantico, Virginia, to the War Gaming Division. And they had this Janus computer, and it's been upgraded since then. But back then, it was a sort of a supercomputer that was designed to do war games. So my job was to identify weaknesses in the Iraqi defenses that could be exploited by the Marines. And so I got the photographs from the CIA. I built on the computer an exact replica of the layout of the Iraqi defensive positions, and then we occupied it with the Iraqi units. Each piece of equipment, each squad, the weapons they had. I did an analysis of the logistical sustainability, where their ammo was, how they would get it. I got into doctrinal employment of troops, which troops had combat experience against Iran, et cetera. And I spent a lot of time programming this. And then I built the Marine units based on unit histories, unit composition, et cetera. Did the same thing. Very detailed calculations going into this. And then you line it up, you give them the direction of advance, you give them their orders, and then you hit play, and then you watch it play out. Boom, 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 boom. And I have to tell you, the first couple of times I hit play, the Marines got wiped out. And we're just sitting there going, that ain't right. Why? So now you have to go down and break all the numbers down. Oh, we gave the Iranians or the Iraqis far too much PK, probability of kill, for their artillery. Let's adjust that to reality. We gave them too high of a rate of fire. They're not that well trained. Adjust that. We didn't give our counter battery fires sufficient lethality. Adjust that. We start adjusting the numbers to get it down. Suddenly we hit this fine point where we hit play. The battle unfolds the way it should. Because there's other times where the Marines just cut through them like that. And we're going, that ain't right either. What's going on? We gave the Marines too much capability, all that stuff. So we find the balance, and then we play this over and over again throughout the line. And I became very good at rapidly assessing combat capability of units in specific terrain and lethality of effect. And here's the thing, what I predicted would occur, because I wrote this up and it was sent to the Marines. What I predicted would occur is exactly what occurred. Exactly what occurred.
So are you doing that? Like, are there Russians and Ukrainians and Americans doing that right now? Like constantly adjusting it to what they're seeing with data? And is that
any professional staff would do this?
Yeah. So that's,
and the Russians have a very good set. I know the United States is war gaming this out constantly in Germany, back in the United States, using the updated Janus computers, which are even faster and better than the ones I use. But my point is,
so you're suggesting the Ukrainian military is not entirely independent of U.S. command and control?
The Ukrainian,
that was a facetious question.
It's a sovereign state with a sovereign military. But I would say that the Ukrainians know that if they deviate from the directions given to them by the Americans, then the outcome will probably be bad. And if they,
so you're even just on the basis of trusting the Americans to know better militarily, maybe, or just have better capacities to do this kind of work.
Well, they have better technology.
Yeah.
And they're uninterrupted by Russian artillery fire, right. Russian aerial attacks. electrical outages. They have
But like if we hear, for example, that it's Zelensky specifically who's refusing to order a retreat from Bakhmut.
No, that's probably accurate. That's probably accurate. The Americans are probably saying you might want to get out of there now, or else you're going to lose these guys. Mm-hmm. And Zelensky is saying, well, if I pull out, then, or the Americans might be saying, you can't pull out because that'll create this morale issue, and you have to sit there and fight, because if morale collapses, then we're going to have a hard time getting Congress to cough up more money. So, I'm not privy to the conversation, but I would say that there's give and take there, where both sides are constantly talking to one another. But my point is, when I look at the battlefield, my brain automatically goes back. It's like anything. If you, I don't know, did you play sports?
Actually, martial arts.
Okay, martial arts. That this is even better. Conditioned response.
Yeah.
Conditioned response. So that you're actually doing something before you actually think about it, because it's conditioned response.
Yeah.
And that happens in combat, especially. You have to be. That's why it's repetitive training, because. And that's why people are yelling at you. That's why you're making noise. That's why it's sleep deprivation, because you have to train like you're going to fight, and your body has to be conditioned to have conditioned response, repetitive motion, so that when boom, 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 people die, blood, screaming, everything, your body's still going to do what it was trained to do. It won't have time to go into shock and think. Well, my brain, unfortunately, has been programmed to look at every combat situation as if it's a giant Janus simulation. And so I just sit there and look, and I'm running the numbers. And believe me, after doing it for 3 solid months, it's repetitive. My brain's conditioned. I know what factors I'm looking for. And, I'm automatically searching out logistical sustainability, command and control. I'm looking at the terrain. I'm looking at the artillery. I'm looking at the weather, because the ground soil conditions impact, what's going to happen. I'm looking at doctrine. Is it going to be, a DP? Or is it going to be airburst, or is it going to be a mix of the two? And you do this, and then you go boom, and suddenly I'm coming out going, the Russians are going to get 8-1 casualty advantage here. Mm-hmm. And so now we look at this, at the mass of fires being brought in, and you start calculating probability of kill based upon density of troop and all that stuff, and you're going, wow, they're going to sustain 60% casualties over this period of time. So you look at the number of troops on the front line, and it's a battalion, and you say, in 2 days, that battalion is going to suffer a 60% casualty rate. That's 500 people. That means 300 and some odd casualties. And now you replicate that across the battlefield, getting the reports of where the battles are going, and the numbers just start adding up. And and then you take a look at what the Ukrainians can do to the Russians. And that's why anybody's sitting there go, the Russians have suffered 180,000 dead. How? You tell me how that happened. Because I'm running the numbers, I'm looking at the thing, and it ain't going to happen. Not on your best day. You could give the Ukrainians 100%, lethality of every round they fired. They're still not going to kill 180,000 Russians. It just doesn't work that way. And then the other thing you have to factor in is the whole. And I have an advantage here because I was in field artillery, and I would actually help train the Marines early on. My battalion took the lead in adapting tactics designed to defeat a Soviet enemy. Other than that, we used to fight, when I came in, we were fighting World War II type artillery battles, and we would all die because the Russians have far more artillery. So we were doing shoot, move, communicate, counter battery war. And so I'm sitting there looking at the artillery war, doing, running the counter battery. I helped perfect early counter battery radar employment.
So are you saying that Americans, and therefore presumably Ukrainians, have a little bit of specific knowledge of how to fight artillery battle from a disadvantage, like on the assumption that the Russians are going to have more artillery?
Yes.
Yes, that's interesting.
No, that's how I trained. Disadvantage. But here's the difference. I operated in a maneuver warfare environment, right, where we could use space and maneuver to our advantage to prevent the Russians or the Soviets from acquiring a situational dominance. Because if we stayed in one place too long, then they were going to come in with artillery that would just wipe us out. So we're moving. The difference here is this is positional warfare, right, which locks the both sides into, disadvantages from, survivability standpoint. For the Ukrainians to be able to put fire on the Russians, they have to bring their systems into range to hit the Russians. And if you can shoot the Russians, they can shoot you. There is no range advantage. Everybody's going the HIMARS out. The Russians have things that outrange the HIMARS. And then the other thing that I developed was I'm literally, again, I'm the guy who first started using Pioneer drones to adjust artillery. Back in 1986, 1987, nobody did that. The Israelis were working on it, but for the United States Marine Corps, for the U.S. military, I'm the guy that helped create, how to integrate drones in this. So I have a little bit of knowledge on how this stuff works theoretically. And so I'm looking at how drones are being applied to the battlefield, et cetera. And the point I'm trying to make is when I come up with a number, it's not pulled out of thin air. It's a number that's actually derived from me spending a couple hours closing my eyes and running the battlefield through my head, looking at maps, looking at organizational structures, trying to find unit histories, and then applying all of that in a comprehensive fashion. Is it perfect? Hell no. This ain't a Janus computer. This is a human brain attached to a 61-year-old man who drinks a lot of Diet Coke to stay awake. So dogs barking, I got people knocking at the door, I got work I got to do. So it's not perfect. I'm not pretending that it's flawless, but I'm telling you this. I believe my numbers, and it's turning out my numbers are actually very accurate because the more we're learning about casualty levels and stuff, I think we don't see from a propaganda standpoint, you get a wide divergence, but when you get to the serious people about numbers, the numbers are starting to gravitate right to where I said they were going to be.
So two questions arise. One is, if assuming Russia's in the process, if Moon of Alabama is correct and Russia's in the process of destroying the third version, the third iteration, is there a fourth? Does NATO have the ability to build a fourth Ukrainian army?
Well, the answer to that is yes and no.
Okay.
Right now, there's anywhere from, I think, probably 40,000 Ukrainian troops that are undergoing training in one form or another out there. They might be able to surge that number up to 70,000 total. That's a significant number of troops.
But that's less than they've already lost.
Oh, it's not enough. The burn rate is higher than the replenishment rate. That's the other basic reality of military math. Your combat effectiveness drops significantly as your numbers go down because you can't do things you were supposed to do. And if you can't replace the numbers, then your combat, and the lower it drops, the higher casualty rate you're going to have. You're going to burn through a lot of people more quickly.
The reason that the maneuver war hasn't happened, that Russia hasn't done it or been able to do it, is presumably partly because of the incredible fortification of an entrenchment of the Ukrainian military. Is there a way that they could use that advantage to keep it going? Because for me, it's like, a lot of these wars take years. Like it's a rare war that takes a year or less to be over. I mean, Georgia was fast, but like the Chechnya wars or Afghanistan, Iraq, these all took a long time.
Well, I don't think this war is going to last beyond late summer, early fall. Because
so another year, maybe.
No, another
half a year,
6 to 8 months.
Yeah.
Because, well, I'll let Jan Stoltenberg speak for me. Ukraine's going to run out of 155 millimeter artillery. There was a Russian officer who spoke of in Bakhmut. They're capturing the Ukrainian, command posts. And so what they're getting is the Ukrainian documentation on ammunition allotment. So if it's a command post with artillery units dedicated, it's the reorder. And on the Soviet stuff, the 122, the 152, it's all nothing. They're getting nothing because they have nothing. They've run out. On the 155 millimeter, actually what he said is they're getting a lot more than we thought they were getting, that the Ukrainians are actually firing more rounds than we thought, because they have to match the intensity of the Russian fighting, the Russian firepower. But the point is that expenditure rate is beyond that which NATO can sustain. NATO's already, we talked earlier about defense industry. Russia's defense industry is up and running. It's kicking out enough ammunition to support this war and the expansion of the Russian military. NATO has not upped its game on defense industry. It takes time. to do that. It takes money, it takes resources, it takes planning, none of which has happened. They're only starting the initial phases of that now. But again, it's also a matter of scope and scale. Many private industries are not going to spend the money necessary to gin up a production line if all you're going to do is produce X. They're going to say, in order for this to be profitable to me, I need X times 20. And nobody's sitting there saying, well, we're going to go ahead and commit to that because they don't know how long this war is going to last. So there's no ammunition being built, in sufficient quantities. So the Ukrainians are burning up in a week and a half, a month's worth of ammunition production. That's unsustainable. Even if you have 1 million rounds in reserve, which we had at one point, those are gone. We've given them all Ukrainians. They fired them. We can't produce anymore. There's nothing left. They run out of ammunition this summer, and there's nothing that can happen to change that equation. And when you run out of artillery ammunition in a war dominated by artillery, you lose. So that's why I believe, one, the Russians don't need to go maneuver warfare on us. I bring this up. Maneuver warfare looks cool on maps, and it's nice in Hollywood because everything's perfect in Hollywood. It always works. But read history. First of all, read the maneuver warfare battles that took place in 1943 around Kharkov with the back and forth, and look at the casualties, extraordinarily high casualties. And then take a look at, for instance, in the summer of 1944, Operation Bagration, which turned into the destruction of Army Group Center. And if you look at the maps, it's like big Soviet arrows, and you're like, wow. And you look at the German casualties, you're like, oh, they swamped them. That's why they collapsed. They're retreating. I say, yeah, but now look at the Soviet casualties. Huge. And you're going, holy cow, they lost 1 million dead? Yep. Big arrow warfare.
In winning, while they were winning.
In winning. That's right. Against an enemy that was collapsing and retreating. So, the Russians don't want that. They don't want that. What they want is to destroy the Ukrainian military. And right now, they have a systemic approach, a very, there's an M word out there, methodological. I don't know. They have a methodology. I'm a Marine. Don't expect me to speak the English language properly. But they have a methodology. There's the word that they use, and it's working. And the other thing people are showing, when does the offensive begin? I'm like, it's already begun.
Yeah,
it's not just
because they're expecting. I've seen Colonel.
Well, they want the big arrows.
Yeah,
but the point is, all along the front, the Russians are attacking from Zaporizhia up to Limon, and even hooking around that. And they're succeeding. Some of the offensives up north are taking 5 to 7 kilometers a day in territory. The Ukrainians, meanwhile, are they're like a fire brigade running around to different fires. Eventually, you run out of firefighters, you run out of engines, you run out of hose, you run out of water. Yeah. And that's what's happening. And this is before the Russians bring all of their forces that are still training, by the way, in deep breakout operations. They haven't even arrived at the battlefield yet. So when they arrive, the Russians are shaping the battlefield to their advantage. They're identifying the weak points in the Ukrainian lines, and they will exploit those. I am very confident that the Ukrainian army cannot sustain the casualties that they are sustaining. I'm very confident that NATO can't replenish the Ukrainian army in a sufficient fashion to keep it combat effective on the totality of the front, and that the Russians are going to be able to sustain this military operation. Ukrainians run out of ammunition sometime in July, August, and it's over.
So I don't think that, unfortunately, the official Ukrainian spokespeople don't agree with the anti-war position, which is like, the way I feel about all this is that the Ukrainians are suffering much worse than anyone else from this whole thing. And I would love if this war could end before there's further destruction of their country. And to that, and that also gets us to the question of like an anti-war movement. And you've been talking about the anti-war rally, and the left right unite against war, which I don't really believe that's a possible thing to do. But what this all seems very, very distant from what an anti-war movement can actually take on. It also seems like the anti-war movement, such as it is in the worst state I've seen it in probably 20 years, in the sense that so many anti-war people are effectively pro-war here. And so like actually anti-war people are very rare. And very far between, and they're instantly attacked as being Putin apologists and so on.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, like, do you have I know you were invited to the rally and uninvited to the rally and re-invited to the rally and made a speech for the rally. So, I think there's going to be another what I would consider to be a more authentically anti-war rally coming up in March, I think, on the anniversary.
March 18th, I think it is there. Yeah.
But like, where do you think, what do you think we, like, anti-war people should be focusing on for the coming year?
Well, let me put first of all, I have to, I think you have to be honest about your biases. And I am strongly biased against the anti-war movement in America today because of my experience with Iraq. I find them hypocritical in the extreme. I find them to have been embracing an anti-war posture when the president's name was Bush, but when the president was renamed Obama, they disappeared overnight.
He single-handedly.
And I'm just like, you guys stand for nothing.
Right.
And they do. They stand for absolutely nothing. I know there's some principled people out there, and there's little kernels of hope, of genuine people, but a movement. There is no anti-war movement in America today. And here's my thing about March 18th. And I've got good friends who are organizing this, and they're going to be there. And I hope they take what I'm about to say in the way I mean it, because I want them to succeed. But I remember they sat there and they mocked the fact that the Rage Against the War Machine only attracted 3,000 people. Yeah. They're like, that's nothing. Well, I want to remind them that they only planned on having 2,000 people show up. That the purpose of this rally wasn't to attract numbers, it was to create an organization that brought divergent points of view together in a singular focus. And while that wasn't perfect, and my experience in it is a little bit bitter, but I'm bigger than that. This ain't the Scott Ritter movement. This is an anti-war movement. And there is potential there if they can get their act together, and that's a big if. I'm not giving them an automatic, that the next time they get together, they might have 10,000. And if they can get their act together, they can turn that to 20,000, 100,000, a million. This has potential to achieve those numbers. March 18th, they're talking about 6,000 people. That's the number. That's their number. That's as big as they're ever going to get because they aren't capable of organizing beyond that. That's the maximum potential of the left anti-war movement. 6,000, 8,000, 10,000. They can't go beyond that because they've self-limited in terms of their purity tests and all this other stuff. Plus, they don't know what they're anti-war about. Are you anti-war or are you anti-suffering? Because here's my point about anti-war. First of all, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, I'm not anti-war. You want to hurt my country? I will kill you with a smile on my face. I will come at you like Attila the Hun, man. I'm a Marine. I'm trained to kill. I'm old now and my knees don't work and my eyes don't work. And so my mouth is the only thing that works. But when I was younger, I'd have been right there urging them going forward. I'm not anti-war. There's a tweet that got me in a lot of trouble, but I'm not retreating from this tweet. Anybody listening to this who has, indicated the dissatisfaction, I don't care because I believe in this tweet. And it was when I was criticized by the Libertarian Party as, you're not anti-war. Well, first of all, where were you in 2002, 2003? I know where I was. I was demonstrating, I was organizing, and I wasn't just out there demonstrating, I was doing stuff like putting my life on the line to go make a documentary film about the truth of weapons of mass destruction, having the FBI come at me like you've never had the FBI come at you before. I'm the guy who went to Iraq in September 2002 and spoke to the Iraqi parliament. No one has ever done that before. I broke all the rules in going over there, and I got the Iraqi government to do that which no one thought possible, which is to invite UN weapons inspectors back in. And that was the only way you were going to stop a war, was to get UN inspectors back in to show that there was no WMD threat. And when that failed, I was the guy that got Saddam Hussein, and no one, I don't think many people know this. I got Saddam Hussein to buy into 6 points of peace that would lead to regime change. Not that he would leave, but the change in behavior. He agreed to this on the eve of war. And if it weren't for the FBI and some other idiots like the libertarians, I'm not blaming them, that mindset, who decided they wanted to destroy me and not give peace a chance, we could have stopped this war, or at least we would have had a fighting chance. So anybody who wants to tell me I'm not anti-war, tell you, I'll meet you in the boxing ring and I'll show you my anti-war technique played out in Morse code on your face. I'm not a peaceful man, but I hate war with a passion. And I wanted to stop that war, and that war broke my spirit, broke my soul, crushed me. I'm just being straight up honest. And the anti-war movement is one of the reasons, because they let me down. They let themselves down. They let the American people down. They let the Iraqi people down. They let the world down. So now people are like, Scott, what do you believe about Ukraine? Well, let me tell you what I believe about Ukraine. I believe this war should never have been fought.
Yeah.
I would have preferred an outcome, but I can't. See, I'm somebody who says, from an American perspective, that we can't go to war unless we've exhausted every option short of war. There's no door to a peaceful resolution that has been opened and walked through, that we have tried everything before we take that down. And that war, even then, has to be worth the sacrifice we're asking of the men and women who are going to shed their blood on that battlefield. And so I'm sitting there putting myself in Putin's shoes saying, what more could he have done?
Yeah.
He spent 8 years begging for Minsk to be implemented. Right. And it turns out that nobody was serious. He was the only serious player there.
Which again, they admitted. And Merkel admitted.
Hollande admitted, Poroshenko admitted it. You know, and Putin has said that was one of the greatest mistakes he's ever made, was believing them. He said we could have ended all of this in 2014 had I just been a little bit more bloodthirsty. But I believed in peace. I believed they wanted peace. I tried to get peace. The draft treaties they put out there, Russia basically said, here's what we need to stop a war. They wouldn't do it. Then Russia carried out a phase 1 operation that cost them a lot of guys because they didn't go to war. They sought to, instead of destroy, to compel to the peace table, and they put it all on the line to achieve that objective, and they were betrayed by the West. So I think,
Ukraine also assassinated their own negotiators. And,
their own negotiator and all that. You know, so, but my point is, I can't think of anything more Putin could have done given the circumstances. So now we're at war. Didn't want it, but we're there. So what's the objective now? I know Putin has strategic objectives. I know Ukraine has.
For us, right?
But for us, what's our objective? It has to be to minimize the suffering.
Yeah.
Once war has become a reality that we can't hit the reverse on, it's there in front of us right now. They're fighting. What do we do as an anti-war movement? You can't say, well, I'm anti-war, therefore I can't do anything that legitimizes this conflict. Dude, it's happening. Yeah. You can't change that. It's done. They're at war. So if you're going to say, well, I'm anti-war, therefore I'm anti-Putin, why? He did everything possible to stop the war. They didn't. They wanted it. What do you need to do to minimize the suffering of people? If you're anti-war, you have to care about the Ukrainian. Let me put it to you this way. At this stage in the game, it's possible that Ukraine has suffered 350,000 plus military dead, probably another 400 to 500,000 wounded. Many of those wounded's brains no longer work. They don't have limbs. They'll be pissing into a bag the rest of their life. All the things we don't like to talk about when, Americans, I support the troops. Really? When was the last time you went to a VA hospital and changed out the colostomy bag of a 32-year-old man who will never walk again because he went to war for your country, the one that you said you wanted to stop, but you didn't stop? I have no patience for these people. So now the Ukrainians are suffering. Tens of millions of Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes. Their homes have been destroyed. Have you looked at the cities where they're fighting right now and the destruction, the level of destruction? Even if the war ends today, they can't go home because there is no home. They are permanently displaced. Now imagine, do you have kids? I'm not asking too personal questions. Yeah. Okay, I have kids. I've raised kids. Thank God I had a stable house, income, etc. So my kids grew up with a sense of normalcy, education, social adaptation, all that stuff. They're pretty cool kids. But imagine now, house catches on fire. That happens, but there's no Red Cross, no nothing. As I go to the street, the neighbors are coming in and hitting me with sticks, driving me away into the woods. I have to go live in a country that doesn't want me, get a job that I'm not. It's not what I'm trained to do. I have to go, shovel poop. and my kids are in a strange school system and their relatives are dying, they can't go home. Those aren't going to be well-adapted kids. We have condemned a generation of Ukrainian children to a horror, to a maladjusted life. Some of them may be lucky enough to get on the right track, but they're going to be forever scarred by this experience. If you are anti-war, you have to be against this happening. And this is happening because we have sustained this conflict 3 times over. This war should have been over early. It could have been over on April 1st. We stopped it. This war could have been over in the summer of 2022 because the Russians were destroying the Ukrainian army. We reinforced. And now we continue to keep this war going by pouring military forces, resources, financial resources, and we don't give a damn about the people of Ukraine. We can't give a damn when you allow that many Ukrainian soldiers to die in 1 year. We can't give a damn when we allow over $1 trillion worth of infrastructure damage that will never be repaired by us. We can't give a damn when we've displaced tens of millions of refugees in their own country and out of their country. Don't tell me we care about the Iraqi or the Ukrainian people. We don't care about the Iraqi people either. We don't care about anybody. This isn't a war fought for a cause. This is a war fought to hurt Russia. And now we come to the Russians, okay, because we talked about the Ukrainians. The Russians have lost potentially some 45,000 men. In the decade that America was in Vietnam, we lost 58,000 men. If this war goes on at the intensity I expect, Russia will match that number or exceed that number by the end of the year. All right. So in a 1.5-year time period, Russia will have suffered casualties equivalent to what we lost in Vietnam, and Vietnam broke the soul of a nation. Okay. Then there's the wounded out there. And again, guys, wounded doesn't mean you got a hole in your body and you walk around, you show the girls the scar and you're cool. Wounded means you're screwed up for life.
Is artillery war.
Artillery, well, if you take a bullet, a high velocity round hits you in the head and you live, your brain is gone. It hits you here, you lose your arm. You're going to, like I said, the internal damage to the body, the spinal injuries, etc. There are tens of thousands of Russians, just like Ukrainians, who will not walk again, who are going to be in wheelchairs, who aren't going to be able to support their families and all that. And then there are the Russian children who watch their father die or their father get crippled. There are the Russian wives who will never be the same, Russian society that's been torn asunder. So this is a two-way street. The sword of war cuts both ways. It's cutting both sides horrifically. And we care, we say we care about humanity. We care about people. If you're, I was going to use a bad word, if you're anti-war, and you say, I support the continuation of this war, what about the Russian people? Don't tell me you're anti-war if you're willing to have them suffer and pretend that you don't want the Ukrainian people to suffer. So there is no anti-war movement right now. The quickest way to bring this nightmare to an end is to bring it to an end. And unfortunately, the only way it's going to end right now is with a decisive Russian military victory. So I'm going to be frank. If you pretend to be anti-war, then you have to support the quickest possible Russian victory in Ukraine, because that'll be the fastest way to stop the death and suffering. Because otherwise, you're going to buy into a system where we continue to fuel this fire, and that fire will burn as many people as possible.
There is one other important point to add to that. I mentioned that I was going to talk to you about this before we started recording, which is, I can't help but be concerned about what happens to Russian speaking Ukrainians in the event of a Ukrainian victory.
Yeah, right. What are we asking for by saying Ukraine wins?
Yeah. So, on the one hand, it's like, the pro, I don't know, I would call them pro-war people who say, we want Ukraine to get Crimea back and get all of their territories back, and that's a victory. But if that happens, what is their plan? What is their plan for the people that are from there and that live there, that they've been at war with? What happens if those people are defeated and they are there? Like, is the idea that they're just going to all go to Russia? Is the plan that they stay there in some reduced form of citizenship? I mean, or, this is one of the problems that I don't hear
the
people thinking through.
The Banderas know what they're going to do, and they've been doing it.
Yeah.
Look at what happened in Izium. Look what happened in the Kharkov regions that were recaptured. Cleansing operations came in. Filtering operations, they call them. They're slaughtering thousands of ethnic Russians. Anybody who was accused of supporting the Russian
Right.
occupation, is being killed, murdered on the spot. Women, men, children. That's the future of every ethnic Russian in the Donbass, in
Yeah.
Zaporizhia, in Kherson, and in Crimea. So if you want Ukraine to win, what you're saying is you're going to tolerate the genocide of millions of ethnic Russians.
Yeah.
And
I don't see a way around that,
right,
unfortunately, which is why I can't.
but there's another thing attached to that should scare people even more. If you say you want Ukraine to win, that means you want them to take Crimea.
Yeah.
And if Ukraine was successful in taking Crimea, this constitutes an existential threat to Russia. And Russia has a nuclear doctrine that says they will use nuclear weapons to stop this. Now, those nuclear weapons will not be dropped on Ukraine because Russia has no intention of nuking a fellow Slav nation. Those nuclear weapons will be dropped on NATO, London, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, Rome, Madrid. Maybe some will make it their way to the United States. Some might make it their way to Canada. The world will end. So all these people out there, saying we want Ukraine to win, you really are saying you want the world to end. There's worse things in the world than accepting the fact that ethnic Russians will have a better life under a Russian government than they would under a Ukrainian government. Maybe when we talked again, maybe when Vladimir Putin talked about the history of development of Ukraine, he was spot on, that this is an artificial nation that has been cobbled together in a artificial manner, and that they can't get along. How can you get along if you're a Western Ukrainian who views the ethnic Russians as subhumans, who has a history of slaughtering them in large numbers, and has proven that it's not just a historical thing that happened, but they're willing to do it now and are doing it now. So if you're anti-war, you might want to start thinking about being pro-partition. You might want to start thinking about the best way to end this war is on the terms that Russia is talking about, because that provides a long-term solution, because your solution only increases the death and destruction, the potential for the termination of all humanity.
Yeah. Well, we've unfortunate. You know what I think of from your history, Scott, is William Tecumseh Sherman. He made this speech when he burned Atlanta, or he wrote it, but he said something like, a couple of years ago, if they had stopped, they would have had peace and harmony for 100 years. If they had stopped last year, they could have even kept their slaves, but now, they're going to lose everything.
Over. And Ukraine's going to lose everything.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a sad fact. If you listen to Putin's February 21st speech that he gave, now in the West, it's been derided. He's angry, he's bitter, he's vengeful.
Yes.
And also because he didn't announce the big aero offensive, it was a
nothing
burger. It was underwhelming, underwhelming. We weren't impressed. Listen to what he said, guys. First thing he said is the focus of effort is the economic and social revitalization of the new Russian territories. Mm-hmm. That means that, hey, the wars are going to stop until they push the Ukrainians out of these territories, and the focus is on building these territories up. Then he said, the nature of the weapons provided by NATO will define how far we have to push the Ukrainians back from these borders. And so when NATO is bragging about HIMARS and the small bomb units will go 150 kilometers, Ukraine, by accepting that weapon system, you just guaranteed that this war won't stop. And remember, Russia's winning, you're not. So this war won't stop until Russian forces have pushed 150 kilometers past the current borders of Novorossiya and Donetsk. And now we come to, I refer people back to Vladimir Putin's 2005 statement, not the one about the Soviet Union collapsing, but the one about he is responsible for all Russians, the Russian nation. If you go 150 kilometers past the Novorossiya and Donbass borders, you get Odessa, you get Dnipropetrovsk, you get Kharkov, Russian cities populated by majority Russian populations. Ukraine, you're going to lose everything. You are going to lose everything. And the West says they support you. Understand that the worst thing that ever happened to you, Ukraine, was buying into the false promise of NATO. Because
who was it that said it's bad to be
Kissinger.
America's enemy?
Kissinger. And he would know.
Yeah, he sure would. So last question. Okay. Chinese peace plan. I guess the Biden already said if Putin likes it, it can't be good. So
Biden knows best.
Biden is, with his diplomatic acumen.
Surprised you didn't say, Vladdy boy.
Yeah,
Vladdy boy. That's why they get the big bucks and you don't.
Maybe it's dead in the water, but I mean, do you think, again, as an anti-war person, here I am, is there some formula with China mediating, or somebody that's credible that could have some kind of deal? Is there a deal that Russia could accept that could
The
be?
Russian deal has to, at this point in time. First, I have to be careful when I say has to, because I don't know.
Yeah.
What I do know is this: that the Russians articulated in phase one demilitarization, denazification, and no NATO. By the time they got to the 1 April peace plan that there was going to be signed, they had walked away from demilitarization. They had walked away from denazification.
Yeah, the Israeli guy said that, right? The Israeli prime minister said.
And all they wanted was no NATO and independence for Donbass, and Crimea is forever Russia. Again, getting back to Tecumseh Sherman, had you stopped fighting 2 years ago, you could have had this. Had they stopped on 1 April, Ukraine would be a viable state, very strong, very healthy, and Russia would actually have more problems than Ukraine does because of the unsatisfactory nature of the peace. But they didn't do that. China is interesting because China and Russia, prior to the invasion, if you remember, Joe Biden, when he met with Vladimir Putin in June of 2021 in Geneva, on his way out, he turned to the press and without anybody provoking, he said, "Yeah, I don't want to give away too much about what I said to Vlad, but I told him, man, the Chinese, you got to get away from those boys. Those are bad boys. They're going to come in. They're trying to take over your economy. They're going to come in. But Vlad, your bad move with the Chinese. You got to come to us, man. Come to us. Be with us. The Chinese are bad people." And Putin's like, "Thank you very much."
Well, there was another speech from a long time ago that's been making the rounds where Biden says, and then I told them, "What are you going to do? Go with China? Best of luck in your senior year."
and then, why don't you try Iran for that standpoint? Well, Joe, thank you.
Well, here
1997.
we are.
Yeah, here we are. Iran, China, Russia together. But the thing is, Biden and not Biden, Putin and Xi Jinping have a very good relationship. Yeah. It's a relationship that has been formed consistently over the years. They are both very long-serving leaders. So it's not like the United States where every 48 years we get this whiplash of leadership and countries are going, "Who are you, Jekyll and Hyde?" Putin has been consistent for 22 years. Xi Jinping has been consistent for nearly the same amount of time. So this is a relationship born of trust and of necessity. China and Russia are not natural allies. They have been brought together because of the policies of the United States, which have been equally oppressive to both. So they've come together. They found common cause. It's an uncomfortable thing for the Russians to do, to commit economically to China, because China is big. There's a danger of China swallowing Russia.
China's so different, right? Russia loves the West. The Russians love the West. They always have.
Russia's learning to be indifferent to the West, because the West deserves to be indifferent too. But Russia's changing. The things are changing. But here's China's problem. The whole key to China's policy towards Taiwan is an Westphalian approach to sovereignty, saying that Taiwan is China. There can be no interference in the internal affairs of China. West, you have to stay out of Taiwan. You can't get involved in Taiwan. That's our business. And Russia went and invaded Ukraine.
It's awkward.
Yeah, because we can't say we support you, because then we'd be supporting this. You've put us in a bind. What do we do? But before the invasion, Putin and Xi got together and they put out this 5,000-word joint statement that basically said, we are closer than allies. We have something better than alliances. And here's where it's important. Because it's true. Imagine a treaty that they had signed where China would have had to impose a Westphalian principle towards sovereignty, because that's China's national policy. And so now you have that treaty and Russia invades Ukraine. Suddenly the relationship is fatally flawed, fatally broken. You can't recover from that. But because there's no treaty, China is able to do the following. We don't really like what you're doing there, but we're not going to sanction you either. We oppose your invasion. We'd like you to get out, but we're going to open up gas pipelines and trading pipelines and the whole thing. So China's been doing this dance because it's not a treaty relationship. It's a relationship that's better than a treaty, and that proves it. But now China's in a situation where the West, they're looking at the West's strategic intent to destroy Russia, and they're saying, there before the grace of God go us. And if Russia fails, if Russia loses, then all of that intent is going to be turned on us, using Taiwan as the same leverage that Ukraine was used against Russia. Yeah. So it's best that we enable Russia to win right now. So in order to walk away from Westphalian principles, you have to redefine the nature of the conflict away from a Russian-Ukrainian conflict into an existential struggle between Russia and the collective West. But before you can do that, you have to show good intent. You can't just walk away from Westphalian principles. You have to put.
I see where you're going. I see. You're saying China's peace deal is insincere, I think.
I'm not saying it's insincere, because I think China would love it if Russia would unconditionally
but they also know that it can't.
But that's not going to happen. It's not a lack of sincerity on the part of China's fault. They put forward a peace agreement that adheres to their principles of Westphalian sovereignty. But they also recognize that it's likely not to happen. And when it's rejected, then China will say that closes the door on issues of sovereignty, and it opens the door on a redefinition of the conflict along the lines of it's Russia's sovereignty that's now threatened by the collective West, that the West is using Ukraine as a proxy to take down Russia, and this is unacceptable because that's what the West is going to do with Taiwan against us. And now they are strategically aligning. There was that old movie, the Twilight movie, where you had a team, you
the
had
wolves
the team,
and the
the werewolves, and you had the vampires, and everybody said, my team Jacob or my team whomever. Well, China's basically saying we're Team Russia. They're putting on the Team Russia shirt. That doesn't mean that they support violations of sovereignty and all that, but they're saying that Russia must win this conflict. That the only way this war comes to an end is that Russia wins this conflict. Now, people are saying, well, that means China's going to provide ammunition. I don't agree. First of all,
Russia doesn't need it.
They don't need it, and they don't want it. Why? If this is an artillery-driven war, which it is, that means the fuel of your war engine is artillery ammunition. And if you want to turn up the heat against Ukraine, you put more fuel in, more ammo, you bang it out. If you need to drag it out, you lessen the fuel. But Russia's hand has to be on that throttle. Yeah. If you give China the ability to supply the ammunition, China's hands on that throttle, and now I'm the Americans going, whoa, wait a minute. China now has control of this war. Hey, China, one China policy. We'd like to renegotiate that thing, but what we need you to do is crank down the ammo. Russia's not going to give control of the throttle to anybody. It's a Russian throttle, Russian war. Russia will hold on to it. So that's why I don't buy into this China giving Russia lethal aid.
So if we were an anti-war, let's see if we can agree. I know you. I think I understand your view. But if an anti-war movement were to have a slogan like, we need a deal that guarantees Russia's long-term security as well as, ends the war and ends the suffering. How about that? Could we have that as a slogan?
I don't know. Here's
I'm trying. Give me something.
Let me throw one at you.
Okay.
All right. What if we step back and get out of the weeds?
Okay.
Take a step back and look at the big picture. What's the biggest fear anybody has about this Russian United States
nuclear Armageddon?
Bingo. This is where we can get agreement, I believe, with everybody. Forget about peace deal, trying to get into the weeds and get involved, because you're not going to win on that one and anywhere. You might come up with an acceptable slogan for you, but the Russians don't care. That
I'll be holding that sign somewhere.
Yeah, and people will be driving by. Some will honk in favor, some will honk to harass you, and that's it. There's your day. There's your week.
I've done that. Yeah.
Who hasn't? Who hasn't? How about this slogan? No to nuclear apocalypse, yes to arms control.
Yeah.
You see, because right now there is no arms control.
Right.
Because of this war,
right,
there is a suspension of the last remaining strategic arms treaty between Russia and the United States. That treaty expires on February 2026. When it expires, there will be no arms control treaties. And because of the level of mistrust that currently exists between Russia and the United States today, this will inevitably lead to an arms race without any checks and balances in place. And because human nature is what it is, and the level of mistrust it is, it's not that there is a possibility of a miscalculation. It is a distinct probability, which means there will be a nuclear exchange and we all die. This is the point I'm trying to get out to the anti-war movement right now. This war is screwed up. Okay, I think we can all agree on that. This war is screwed up, and you may believe this, I may believe that, and we're not going to agree. But what we can agree is we don't want this war to turn into a nuclear apocalypse. So let's walk away from this war,
Right.
and let's focus on the big picture. Because we ain't going to solve this war. It's going to solve itself. That's the tragic reality. Because the U.S. isn't going to stop providing arms, and the Russians aren't going to stop killing Ukrainians. And so this war will solve itself. What we need to focus on is getting Russians and Americans back together at the negotiating table. That's our number one priority. Not to tell them how the outcome should be. That's prescriptive, and that doesn't work. I can tell you as an arms controller. But that you must sit down and start the business of talking now. It takes 3 to 5 years to negotiate an effective arms control agreement. We're not going to get that. At best, we're going to get some momentum post-2024 election and have 1 year, get a treaty done, which means you got to sit down in earnest and you have to mean it, and it has to work. You get one shot at this. And that isn't going to happen if you have politicians and arms control experts who remain hostile to that notion. Yeah. They have to be empowered by the people in the same way that the Reagan administration, because remember, study the history of the Reagan administration. Early on, they did not like arms control. Richard Pearl and company were against it. Even Paul Nietzsche, the negotiator, wasn't too thrilled about it. Richard Burt, didn't like it. And in June of 1982, 1 million people gathered in Central Park and sent a message that we support arms control. Yes to arms control. And that liberated the politicians. And 5 years later, we got the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that then spilled over to the START Treaty, and we began a nice process that now has been reversed. So if people say, I'm anti-war, what can I do? I'm telling you right now, I'll give you a date. June 22nd, 2024. Join me and other people in Central Park or wherever you want to come up. Let's get millions of people to come out that day and send us a signal. We're not protesting against anything. We're protesting for, we're demonstrating in support of arms control. Because if we don't solve that problem, all this other stuff doesn't matter. None of it matters. And now we come back to one of the original things we talked about. Can the left and the right come together? As an anti-war movement? Probably not. Probably isn't going to happen. But as a pro-disarmament movement, to save the world, to save humanity, to save their children, to make it possible for their respective causes to have a chance to succeed in succeeding generations, even if you guys don't agree with one another.
So we can keep fighting each other even.
Keep fighting each other, which is perfect in a democracy. That's what makes a democracy work. Right. But in order to give this imperfect democratic system a chance to live and thrive and work in all of its horrific irregularities, we have to be alive. So can we get together on the issue of arms control and send a signal to anybody running for office in the 2024 election that if you don't sign on to a litmus test, it's a simple one. Will you make arms control your number one policy objective if elected? Yes or no? I want you to commit right now. And if the answer is no, then all the millions of people say, we don't vote for you. Yeah. That's as simple. It doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat if you don't say that. Now, if you say yes, then we have an issue because if, let's say, a Democrat says yes, a Republican says yes, then the vote's going to split up and whoever else can do the other stuff. But you got to say yes. Right. Got to say yes to arms control. That is a movement I think we can get a lot of people to buy into.
Thank you, Scott. So if you're right, and this war is over in 6 to 8 months, we'll talk again then.
Go buy me a beer.
I'll buy you a beer, and also if you're wrong, then we'll probably
I'll buy you a beer.
Yeah, you'll buy me a beer, and we'll talk at the end of year 2. Okay, thanks, Scott.
Okay, thank you.